Competitive kleptocracy. Maybe we could clarify. I mean, you talked big business, oligarchs. I mean, you actually, I mean, these are basically synonyms. The big business actors in Ukraine are conceptualized as oligarchs.
Yes.
Okay. What is it?
I skipped the word oligarchs because it has negative connotation, and my idea to approach them just like a rational actors. They have their cost benefits, but they are not simple business elites as they dominate certain sectors in Ukrainian economy, and they are also politically influential beyond, so above the level what we would expect from Western-like business elites. So that's why I talk about them as big business elites.
Okay,
Yeah.
but okay, big business, but
Yeah,
oligarchs.
yeah.
But let's just try to get. I mean, you're doing actually a comparative analysis. What it means in practice as a concept, how useful. I mean, obviously, concept in public discourse always have normative connotations, whether good or bad. But basically, we're talking about here economic actors that have accumulated resources through rent, which in the Ukrainian case meant essentially they're getting subsidized by the states, particularly through controlling assets, but getting kind of monopoly access to energy routes. So rent seeking, and then, and to be simple here, maybe not in academic language, buying off politicians. They're using actually their resources to buy politicians, because there seems to be an actor missing here in the picture. Your business actors, we have to approach them as rational actors, but the political officials, the state officials, also are rational actors. And they benefit clearly from what has been generally referred to as the oligarchic system or the kleptocratic system in Ukraine. Now, perhaps not to the benefit of state interests, which is a different issue. Yesterday, we had a lively discussion with Jesse Driscoll about some of it had to do with the political economy of the areas currently not controlled by the Ukrainian state, the DNR, Donetsk, Luhansk. And he was saying that if you really want to co-opt them, get them back into the system, you need to pay them off better than what they benefit from currently. Now, currently in DNR, for the overwhelming majority of the population, it's an economic cataclysm, right? The social and economic consequences of the war are for everyone to see. Which doesn't mean that the elites actually don't have a good deal. They have a terrific deal with smuggling and control of subsidies and aid from Russia and so forth. So it is, in that sense, economically rational for the current elites in DNR and LNR to continue, even though they're ruling over a devastated land. Picture is different in Ukraine, but instead of talking about war or devastation, we're talking about predatory acts that basically pilfer the state, prevent the state from having the kind of resources to develop programs or even to fund the army, right? So basically the fundamental question here is, what does it take to break these dynamics so that it would no longer be optimal or rational, not only for your business elites, but for your state officials, to continue benefiting from the system. And we had a striking illustration of what it means for state officials to benefit from the system last week when the wealth and the assets of all state officials had to be revealed. And we find out that every single deputy or governor of the bank and so forth, not only are they wealthy, but they're sitting on mountains of cash, sometimes millions of dollars in actual cash, not even in bank accounts. How do they get this cash? Well, we know how. It's precisely when we talk about business influence of the oligarchs, and that's the buying off. It's beneficial to both parties. How do you break this off? And that's the cardinal question in Ukraine.
Okay, so several questions inside of this. I will start with the basic. So why I use these terms. kleptocracy and big business. So I would say that oligarchy and oligarchs are perhaps the terms that were more appropriate to describe the initial phase of this interaction between business and politics, when indeed there was initial accumulation of capital and the politicians were just bought out by financiers. But these days we have different situations. So big business develops other kind of financial and corporate activities, not limited just to state subsidies via sharing partially some state companies. They also have just normal business, especially those ones that is involved into international markets. So that's why.
What's a normal business?
So exporting, investing in.
But for export, they need state licenses, and then they need to pay off state officials.
Yes, of course. But so another activity is, for example, this financial borrowing, where state is not so pretty much present, and where there is the potential to change their behavior at home, even despite what is going on at the state level. And then
If I can ask, since there's so many issues here, your point is that because of this, they're increasingly embedded in international markets, they borrow money, they have the conditionality, quote unquote, is basically they have to open their books, they have to be transparent. The big caveat is a lot of it is going offshore, but it's going offshore not only from Ukraine, but from all Western states. But that's a separate issue, a big contradiction. But your argument is that that conditionality, so that the increasing transparency then has the potential to carry over in Ukrainian domestic politics. But what's the mechanism? What's the mechanism? Why would greater accountability, let's say, towards European or American investors will actually break here this cycle of having to pay off politicians so that you not only have influence, but you can actually write legislation, making sure you have your watchers in parliament, in ministries. Of course, being immune to any kind of prosecution, that is also part of the deal. So what's the mechanism?
Of course, the mechanism is not ideal and do not work directly, so that there is direct effect on Ukrainian politics in domestic sphere. So, but indeed, this transparency and new standards of accountability, they are not limited just to foreign investors. These big business holdings, they restructure their companies. The shapes of their holdings became visible. Who owns what? We know this already. They publish white papers with their accountability reports and with their strategical development plans. So there is certain transparency at this level. The issue is that what we would expect theoretically, then they have to in the course of this transparency as its result to care about the security, and for this promote and push for security of property rights and the rule of law at a general level. But the problem is, yes, exactly. The problem is that this general push doesn't happen. Partially because this internationalization in the global markets happens via these offshore jurisdictions, and so there is no this big pressure to secure and to push for good property rights at home. You are secured by EU law, for example, if you go for IPOs, as SKM did via Cyprus offshore jurisdiction. And then it's very rational and very profitable. You can go into financial markets, secure your property rights via EU jurisdiction, and at the same time you can use rent-seeking sources that are still available in Ukraine. So this is the mechanism of what we observe these days. And another point, you mentioned, I talk about kleptocracy and not about corruption, and especially political corruption, or state capture is also a very famous term, because we have false impressions that we have good politicians and then bad oligarchs that capture state and politicians, and if we do something with oligarchs and good guys will do their job. No, this is kleptocracy, where corruption is not a failure of institutions, but rather the functional mechanism how it work in Ukraine, so business and politics. And to cut the ties, this is ideal scenario, but it would be very difficult to implement. We have this new law on state financing of the parties, but there are still many pitfalls in it that put some doubts whether this will work pretty well. So I think rather than talk about cut, we need to talk about formalization and bringing more transparency into this.
But what you're saying is that there is a global problem that really impedes democratization or rule of law processes in countries like Ukraine, and it's the offshore. Of course, offshore doesn't just apply, affects Ukraine, it affects Canada, United States, and it's a huge issue.
And if we talk about Western societies, then actually what we have is these offshores, this undermine democracy promotion and developmental policies, because, and it's not just that we do nothing or do little as we do it with democracy promotion. Here we are complicit of this mechanism because we...
And so is the EU as an actor.
Exactly.
It may be rationally optimal for EU actors to actually turn basically their glance away from offshore, tolerate that, even though it actually contradicts the program of rule of law building and anti-corruption.
Exactly. So,
great. Let's take questions, Jennifer.
I wanted to ask a question. There's something that, to my skeptical anthropological American mind, seems to be missing, and I don't think it changes your argument, but it might complicate it. And that is, I see the term crooked capitalism, and I don't understand how that's different from capitalism. And you know, when we look at these endpoints and say, like, how does large business coexist or fail to coexist with democracy? You know, capitalism is based on self-accumulation and not just the monopolization of wealth, but the monopolization of opportunity and privilege and things like that. And it is in many ways the antithesis of democracy. And we actually even have people from the World Bank suggesting that this might be true now because apparently hell has frozen over. So how do we work that into this, right? So if we live in a place where big business and democracy are just two things that don't go together, what really is our endpoint? Is it about, you know, controlling business for the sake of allowing democracy to develop, or are we really talking about a strong state sort of scenario? Are we talking about having a representative government that can keep capitalism in check? Like, what? Because I question the appropriateness of the label democracy on your y-axis. Is that the right term? I would like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
So of course, say this mechanism has a great potential for generalization, and crooked capitalism is perhaps not the only problem of Ukraine or countries in Eurasia. But I would say so we have certainly the influence of business elites all over the world, but what matters is the scope of this influence, and in these countries it's like our hand influence. So actually, as regards the behavior and tools to influence politics in Ukraine, it's even new innovation in big business research, because this elite seems to have new political strategies that were not familiar to be there for a Western style of business. So usually Western style business elites, when we talk about their political influence, we talk about their organizational power, their structural power. But for these countries, we even have a new kind of power, political power, when they become to real political actors. But indeed, this problem of crook capitalism is not the problem of one state and cannot be solved on the state level. We need to have international cooperation on this, and there are already some steps in this direction. Especially now after the Panama Papers. So we know that there is a list of this offshore jurisdiction, there is a blacklist of those that do not comply with the rules of transparency of beneficial ownership. So there are certain steps we are going in the right direction to deal with this crook capitalism.
To Jennifer's question, instead of using a normative concept in particularly the adjective here, considering the electoral campaign, that's a word that resonates. But in terms of concepts here, you're talking about a market economy, you're talking about rule of law, you're talking about pluralism. Yes. You're saying actually the oligarchic system, interestingly, Luke and Wei has made that argument for a decade, actually reinforces pluralism, because contrary to Russia, the state has never been able to control a kind of a multiplicity, like a plurality of oligarch groups, and then that means that the media in some crucial points, such as Maidan, can actually defect from the state and start not towing the party line. But basically, market economy, rule of law, and pluralism. And here, I mean, rule of law is low, so that's your question. How do you actually develop a market economy under conditions of low rule of law and under international conditions where offshores are clearly legally dubious? So the rule of law, however entrenched in international system and Western system, here there's a huge and growing contradiction. So maybe that would avoid for you the pitfalls of using normative or all-encompassing concepts such as capitalism. Anyway, just my grain. Another question?
Yes, I'm Dennis Kowalski. I work as a volunteer, as an advisor to the Association of Farmers of Ukraine, volunteer basis. I'm a retired farmer from Canada. Anyways, when you talk about robber barons, the transformation of robber barons to capitalists, you in Ukraine do not have robber barons in that classical sense as they had in the US. You have what do you call bandits. Robber barons in the US were a different bunch. They invested their money back into factories and all that kind of stuff. They didn't move their money into Panama and Cyprus and all that kind of stuff, which is what your bandits do. So just to clarify that. But I just want to ask you about the moratorium on the sale of land, or specifically farmland. Will that moratorium be continued or not? That's very specific, because if the moratorium comes off January 1st, the agricultural land will be grabbed up by Chinese, your bandits, and every other scum from around the world. So I want to just ask you, will Poroshenko sign that law and sign it into law? That the moratorium to continue? Thank you.
Oh, this is a difficult question.
But it is the question.
Yeah.
It is a question. The moratorium comes off. This is as big, almost as big a tragedy as the war, and it's not a civil war, by the way. So.
Yeah. So perhaps I just bring about what you point out, that we do not have only, when we think about big business in Ukraine, we think first of all about coal sector, mining, metallurgy, but the landscape of oligarchs or big business changed over time in Ukraine, and we have also a very big agrarian big business in Ukraine, one of the fifth on the Forbes list for Ukraine is Yuri Kostyuk, so one of these group representatives. And after Maidan, this agrarian business is increasingly presented through different parties in Ukrainian parliament and indeed influence different kinds of agrarian sector relevant policy making. So until now, it was taking into account their political influence and presence in the parliament. Apparently, it was beneficial for them to keep this moratorium in place. So I don't see any changes at the moment to lift this moratorium and to start with land selling. But even if it will happen, so the same is about privatization of state companies, we can expect that they will have preferable treatment of state authorities in these selling actions. So it will not harm their dominance in this sector. Rather, it will be additional source of rent seeking for them. Still, there are different groups even among this agrarian lobby, and we can expect that there will be certain increase in the competition between business elites. And when we have competition and rivalry between them, it's always good, because through this competition, actually, we have a kind of political pluralism and, at the end, democracy by default in Ukraine.
On the point that the American oligarchs a century ago reinvested in their domestic assets, while the Ukrainian oligarchs don't do that. What's the evidence, let's say, of the last 5-10 years? Because you're talking about a certain degree of normalization or embedment in the international markets. Is there evidence of a certain degree of reinvestment?
Yes, actually, we can say that if you look who is investing in Ukraine, you will realize that there is a great share of investments from Netherlands and from Cyprus. And so we might expect that these are not Cyprus businessmen who are investing, but rather this is the circle of Ukrainian, whatever we call them. Ukrainian business is reinvesting in Ukraine. But of course, investment is risky and costly. And here again, we have this type of property rights security that is provided by this offshore and this cycling. Yeah.
All right, Natalia, question?
Thanks for your presentation. You mentioned that your book deals both with Russia and Ukraine. So I'm just curious to hear a little bit how Russia compares to Ukraine in the way big business is institutionalized, and whether that comparative angle helped you to understand something about the Ukrainian case. Thank you.
So when I compare Ukrainian and Russian business, especially their involvement in global financial markets, actually I come to more pessimistic conclusion, because it seems that Russian business elites are even much more integrated into financial markets and exposed to this transformative conditionality in a more extensive way, but there is no transmission of this positive influence into domestic Russian politics as we would expect or wish it theoretically, rather due to high hierarchization of domestic politics in Russia, this positive corporate governance and good behavior of stationary business in Russia is transformed into cooperative behavior towards Putin regime. In this sense, this domestic context of Russian politics compromise the positive influence of transformative power of global financial markets.
Questions? Yes?
Дмитрий Харьков. given how Ukrainian economy is degrading really fast since Maidan, okay? So these people now, they are losing, I mean, big businesses, oligarchs, real people, they're losing a lot of cash flow and they start losing assets. So given they acted in the past in their interest, they have logically to start acting now to stop this degradation because to protect their own interests. Can you share your opinion, even speculate on how these real people can act to stop this degradation, economic degradation and political, social at the same time?
So first of all, of course, we have huge economic problems after Maidan, but these problems have more deep roots, and so we just had an outcome of old structural problems in Ukraine when we have these drops in GDP and so on. Currently, the macro financial situation stabilized, but we still have the structural problems that make Ukrainian economy pretty much vulnerable. And indeed, we have a huge drop, even more than the general level of GDP in Ukraine, more substantial drop in assets of big business. So if we take the example of Rinat Akhmetov, his assets dropped by 30%. So now instead of like 13.5 billions in 2013, he owns now 2.3 according to the Forbes, so it's a huge drop. The question is how they will behave out of this drop, whether they would prefer just to secure what they still have, or whether they will grasp any kind of chance to continue with rent seeking and to compensate for these losses. And when we analyze what happened in these economic circles previously, because it's not the first drop in assets for Ukrainian business, there was one, for example, in 2008 and 2009 after global financial crisis. So actually we see that they use any opportunity if they have to go for another rent seeking and to reaccumulate new assets. So the crisis, through they have a potential to make them think more about security of their properties, do not stop them from rent seeking behavior.
On that point, in the last 2 years, there appears to have been a qualitative change regarding energy rent. Experts such as Anders Eslund have argued that actually the rents have stopped, that the intermediate company, Firtash, are gone, and that Naftogaz, Ukrainian state Naftogaz, is no longer subsidizing, either for individuals, but also for business enterprises, the gas, energy prices, which, of course, we know historically was the major source of enrichment in the creation of these groups. So even in the short term or in the middle term, what effect does it have on your group of rational actors?
So of course then they have one source of rent seeking less, and but then they would look for compensation of these rents, perhaps from other source of rent seeking if it is available. So until they have these sources of rents, then they will look for this. But the positive effect, of course, that then we have different business groups have this problem, and we can expect, and we saw this in 2 last years, increased competition and rivalry of remaining resources and rents among Ukrainian big business. So there was big signs of this undercover competition around Ministry of Energy between two groups close to Prime Minister Yatsenyuk and the President Poroshenko. So increased competition due to the scarcity of rents and rent-seeking sources, it's good news for those who look for taming Ukrainian oligarchy.
On this note, I want to thank you for the presentation, the discussion.